What's up, guys, and welcome to OneTake. I'm Gil, and we are about to talk about the Watchmen season finale. But before we do that, I just want to quickly say that if you are watching this video and you're not currently subscribed to this channel, make sure to subscribe so you get notifications when we do more live streams. We'll be doing videos on the new Star Wars movie later this week. And also make sure to subscribe to the OneTake podcast, because we're going to talk about the Watchmen finale tonight, but tomorrow on the podcast, we'll do a deep dive discussion on the episode. But without further delay, let's talk about the season finale. And I'll say up front that I have kind of mixed feelings about it. There were some things I loved in this episode, and some things that kind of left me feeling maybe dissatisfied. I need to watch it again and give it some more thought. But I'll say one of my consistent criticisms of this show has been its balancing act between character, emotion, philosophy, and mystery. The show has taken this mystery box approach where it's got interesting things to say about race, about playing God, about putting on a mask. Who would put on a mask? Why would they do it? What happens to someone who wears a mask to be a vigilante? It has those interesting questions and great characters, but oftentimes I find the show gets overshadowed by the mystery box element. What's going to happen next? What's going on with Adrian Veidt? What is the Millennium Clock? How is all this stuff going to tie together? And the key example for me is that in tonight's episode, which should have been a very tense and important moment, Dr. Manhattan is trapped in the machine. His wife Angela is next to him. I should be feeling great danger and peril, suspense, thinking to myself, I don't want Dr. Manhattan to die. And I was feeling a little bit of that, but more of me was feeling, what's going to happen when they flip that switch? What would it look like for there to be a second Dr. Manhattan? How would that second Dr. Manhattan behave? So I found myself kind of distracted by the mystery aspect. And taking the show as a mystery, was it a satisfying one? And I would say overall, if I look back at the last 9 episodes, in general, yes. The show asked interesting questions. I thought it doled out answers at a pace that kept you satisfied while still leaving other questions. I also love the fact that the twists the show had, for example, Lady Trieu being Adrian Veidt's daughter, Dr. Manhattan being Angela's husband, Cal. All those twists, I think just about every single one of them I saw predicted online in fan theories. And I actually appreciate that, because it means that they didn't cheat. They didn't pull the rug out from under us by doing some random twist that makes no sense. They gave us enough breadcrumbs to put things together, but there were always enough red herrings where you didn't know for sure if these theories would be right. So I thought in general the mysteries were satisfying. I will say that in this episode in particular, it was a little bit disappointing that when we finally figure out what the Millennium Clock is and what Lady Trieu's plan is, it was essentially exactly the same as the Cyclops' plan. She was trying to destroy Dr. Manhattan and take his powers. And it felt a little bit like a red herring that earlier in the season, when somebody asks Lady Trieu's daughter, or really her mother, what the Millennium Clock does, she says it tells time. And I assumed that was going to be a double entendre where, yes, obviously it does more than tell time, but somehow it's going to tie in with the concept of time. And unless I'm missing something, I don't think it did. Feel free to let me know in the comments if I'm way off. All right, so I have to say, my tech people aren't here right now, so they're going to be giving me tech tips in the chat live. So it looks like my audio might be slightly off, and we're going to see if we can fix that right now. So hopefully that is better. But you're here to hear me, not see me, right? So hopefully it shouldn't matter. But anyway, so let me know in the comments if there was some kind of implicate or something more to the Millennium Clock that I'm missing. So I wonder if this episode and the show as a whole would be more satisfying if they kind of turned down the whole mystery box element a little bit. If they had revealed some of these answers sooner. If we had known the 7th Cavalry's plan and Lady Trieu's plan sooner, maybe we could have been more focused on the characters and more focused on the suspense of this episode. So there were things I loved in this episode, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. But last thing I want to say kind of on this topic is I rarely in this show felt true peril or true tension, because it was always overshadowed by that curiosity. What's going to happen next? I want the answers to these questions. I felt a little bit of danger this episode, which I'll talk about shortly, and probably way back in, I believe, episode 4 or 5, I felt danger when the 7th Cavalry were going after Wade. And then even that was kind of resolved off screen, and we will get to that in a bit. And Adam is back to tell me to increase audio offset once again. Let's see if that's better. I know how frustrating it is to see lips move and the audio doesn't go along with it perfectly. Anyway, let's talk about the final scene of this season. Angela eating the egg, as predicted by, I think, just about everyone who watched last week's episode. Dr. Manhattan's powers were going to be transferred to someone through an egg. And finally, at the end of this episode, it is heavily implied that he did exactly that. In fact, I will say it was a little bit on the nose that Angela picks up the egg and they actually give us a flashback to Dr. Manhattan explaining, I suppose I could put my powers into something like, I don't know, an egg. Kind of like Damon Lindelof, you don't have to replay that audio for us. We all remember, we're all astute viewers. Anyway, Angela goes outside to the pool, picks up the Dr. Manhattan egg, and cracks it directly into her mouth. Which, by the way, very badass way to eat an egg. I'm not sure I could have pulled that off. She eats the egg, and then she slowly lowers her foot to the water. Will she be able to walk on water? A cover of the song I Am the Walrus begins to play, and then in the fashion of movies like, somebody in the comments, what's the name of that Christopher Nolan movie about dreams? Inception. In Inception fashion, we cut to black before Angela's foot makes contact with the water. So, was Angela able to walk on water? Does she have Dr. Manhattan's powers? I'm going to say it's not even ambiguous. She definitely does. Because the show gave us so many signals that that was the case. Dr. Manhattan told her that it's important for her to see him walk on water. Dr. Manhattan told Will, you got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, and it's going to make sense to Angela eventually. Angela says, I don't know what that means. Will says, well, now must not be the time when it'll make sense. So it seems to me there really is no other possibility besides Angela ate the egg and did inherit at least some of Dr. Manhattan's powers. I actually find it strange that they did leave it ambiguous. I'm not sure what they're trying to say there, because in the visual language of the show, it's ambiguous. We didn't see it happen, but so many signs point to the power transferring that I really don't think there's any other explanation. Stanley McNatt in the chat says, if Angela absorbed his powers, would she not exhibit at least some blue effect? Kind of hard to say, considering we also thought before this show aired that Dr. Manhattan doesn't have the ability to mimic a human being. He had the human form, except he was blue, but apparently with very little effort, he was able to make himself look human. And on top of that, maybe he didn't transfer all of his powers to her. Maybe he may have also designed the egg to transfer the powers in such a way that they wouldn't manifest right away. Because you've got to think he can basically make that egg do whatever he wants. And it would make sense that he would want the powers to manifest gradually. Imagine if you ate an egg and suddenly you turned blue and you started glowing and you had to struggle to keep control, or perhaps make sure you don't hurt someone near you. So I think we don't really know how it would work, but I could definitely imagine a scenario where Dr. Manhattan purposefully tried to make the power transfer subtle, and perhaps she would, at least for the time being, retain her human form. I also want to talk about, just before this scene, Angela and Will talking. And I have to be honest, this was another moment in the episode where I kind of had mixed feelings. It was kind of cathartic to see the two of them talk after all this stuff is done. Angela and Will can finally speak on equal grounds, where they both know everything they have to know. There's no more mystery left. But the thing that kind of felt odd to me is that Will talks about why he put on the hood, why he put on the mask. And he says that it wasn't anger that I felt. It was fear and hurt. You can't heal under a mask. Wounds need air. And it felt like the show was trying to wrap up a theme, the theme of hiding behind a mask. And that's fair. I think early on in this season, that certainly was a theme, and in certain episodes, it was a theme. But to me, this show felt like it really got away from vigilantes. It got away from superhero antics. And although it was there early on, it kind of felt like I sort of forgot about the mask theme, and this tries to bring it back, and it kind of just felt like you're bringing back the theme of wearing a mask, when the last 2 episodes we've been dealing with a whole bunch of people trying to gain the power of God. And to me, the later focus of the series has much more been on trying to gain power, believing you know what is right, believing that because you know what is right, you can do whatever you want, everyone else be damned. You can put whoever else you want in danger as long as what you're doing is the right thing. That's what Adrian Veidt believes. That's what Lady Trieu believes. To some degree, maybe that's what Angela believes. And I think Will Reeves for sure. So I definitely see how that's tied into wearing masks, but it felt a little odd to me that we left that theme behind, didn't really talk about it a whole lot, and now they're punctuating it in basically the final scene of the show, at least the final one with a significant amount of dialogue. But let me know in the comments. Like I keep saying, I kind of had mixed feelings. I'm about to talk about one of my favorite parts of the episode that I absolutely loved. But did you have mixed feelings as well, or did you find this to be a totally satisfying conclusion? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, so one of my favorite parts of the episode are when Lady Trieu finally activates the Millennium Clock. The score kicks in. One of the best things about this season is that kind of synth score that gives it a sort of 80s feel. And here, with that score and with what the closed caption called warbling, that kind of sound effect that was just going when that machine turned on, that moment felt dangerous. You felt like, what the hell's about to happen? Are a bunch of people going to die? Even though we knew the intent of the machine, it just felt world-endingly bad what was happening there. And then to punctuate that, you get Adrian Veidt turning to the guy at the newsstand saying, and I may slightly be paraphrasing here, Israel is desolate and her seed is no more. Palestine has become a widow for Egypt. It's the end, my friend. The end is nigh. And Adrian Veidt, a character who is the self-entitled smartest man in the world, seeing him rattled like that, and I saw true fear in his face. Seeing that man scared, that hit me and worked really well. Then, in the 7th Cavalry hideout, how great was it to finally get confirmation that Looking Glass is alive, that he's got the mask on, and I love just how calm and collected and in control he is when he goes up to Laurie, who's tied to that chair, and he says to her, "Stay cool, don't look at me. I said don't look at me. Sit tight. As soon as I get a chance, I'll get us out of here." Great to hear Wade again. Great to at least get a little bit of interaction between him and Laurie. I will say it is a bummer that we didn't get to see more of Laurie or Looking Glass this season. We did, I guess I'm being a little bit selfish because we did get an episode each where we deep dive into those characters, but they were really interesting characters, and I kind of wish we got to see more of them. But hey, that's what second seasons are for, right? Will there be a season 2? Let's talk about that later in the stream. Then, in the 7th Cavalry basement, Dr. Manhattan gets zapped into the room, and again, a very powerful moment where Laurie, in just one line, she says, "John?" And you can just hear her. She's destroyed inside. The man who she was in love with so many years ago, who's been missing from her life and totally out of contact for all this time, she sees him again, and I thought that line hit really hard. One of the most powerful moments for me in this season was in the Laurie-focused episode where it used that framing device, where the whole episode she's in the Dr. Manhattan phone booth, and she's calling him, leaving this message. At the end of the episode, we see this calm, collected character kind of break down and just essentially admit Dr. Manhattan doesn't give a crap. He's gone and he's never coming back. This felt like a sequel to that moment. It worked really well. Again, kind of a bummer that we didn't get to see Laurie and Dr. Manhattan interact at all in any kind of a direct way. And in theory, we'll never get that opportunity because unlike last episode where I proclaimed at the beginning of my live stream, oh my God, Dr. Manhattan is dead, this time Dr. Manhattan, I believe, is actually dead. But if I'm wrong again, I know that someone in the comments, either right now or after I post this, will correct me, sometimes with pejorative terms. Mike in the chat says, they kept saying destroyed, but not sure if energy can really be killed off. Interested to see what they do with the series, if they even continue it. It's a good point. I mean, how do you kill Dr. Manhattan? The problem is that it's all science fiction, right? We don't really understand the mechanics of how Dr. Manhattan exists. We know that tachyons were involved in his creation, but where is his consciousness located? Right? When he took human form, he had a brain. But for several months after his initial accident, if you read the graphic novel, the origin story for Dr. Manhattan is fascinating. One of the interesting things is that he's obliterated. He disappears in that initial accident. Then a little while later, basically a human respiratory system just appears. So you get the idea that this human being, John, was destroyed and then slowly builds himself back together. So in that case, his consciousness still existed somewhere, not located inside a biological brain. So to Mike's point, could he be destroyed and still exist somewhere out there? It's possible. If they come back into season 2 and say, yes, his consciousness still exists in the ether somewhere, none of us can really say no, because again, it's all science fiction. So they can come up with an explanation that is consistent with what we've seen on the show. Stanley in the chat, at what point in time did he transfer power to the egg? I believe that would be in the previous episode when he's making waffles and you see him floating eggs and milk and other things out of the fridge in the air. At the time, it felt very bizarre. Why is he suddenly just taking eggs out of the fridge? But looking back, I believe that would be when he transferred powers to the egg. Back in the 7th Cavalry hideout, like I was just saying, Dr. Manhattan gets zapped into there. And I thought it was kind of funny, Senator Keene, when he starts taking his clothes off and he's wearing that underwear, which looks like basically the same underwear that Dr. Manhattan wore in Vietnam before he decided to just walk around nude. I guess Senator Keene still is, as a human, he's still a little bit uncomfortable with the whole nudity thing, but I bet if he were successful in becoming Dr. Manhattan, eventually he would have gotten more comfortable in his new skin. I'll say it was kind of lame that Senator Keene gave his whole villain speech. Watchmen is a series that, in the graphic novel and in this show, consistently subverts the expectations of the superhero genre. One of those expectations is villains literally explaining their master plan right before enacting it, and here we actually see him do that. But I will say that the show made it as plausible as they possibly could have, because Keene is the kind of person who likes to bolster about the things he's doing. They were also trying to sort of make it an event in almost a cult-like manner for the 7th Cavalry, so it felt a little lame to me, but I went with it. Mike in the chat, wonder if they'll have a trial on Earth for Ozymandias, and it'll be funny if his clones make it to Earth to spring him from prison. That would be funny, but I can't really imagine a scenario where that happens. Unless Ozymandias left... No, I was going to say if Ozymandias left some of his equipment back there, maybe the clones could learn how to use it. But even Adrian Veidt had to be rescued by a ship. The best he could do was leave a message on the moon. So I can't really imagine a scenario where those clones make it back to Earth unless Angela, with her new Dr. Manhattan powers, remembers the story that John told her, and she remembers that there's a bunch of life on Europa right now, and they're all going to be depressed now because their god has once again abandoned them. Maybe she'll feel bad for them. She'll go to Europa and she'll bring the clones back home and give them a new home, or maybe she'll just leave them there. Who knows? So kind of lame, I thought, that Keene gave his whole supervillain speech. But I will say, when Lady Trieu went to go open the container that had Senator Keene in it, did anybody else worry for a second that when she opened up that container, there would be a second Dr. Manhattan in there, that somehow the process was successful even though it was all interrupted in the middle of it? Part of me expected there to be a second Dr. Manhattan in there, and that would have been a pretty cool way for the show to go. I'll say that I kept saying when I was trying to predict the ending of this season that Watchmen doesn't feel like the kind of show where you get a clean ending, right? The ending of the original graphic novel lays waste to 3 million people in New York City. So I was pretty shocked at how well things turned out at the end of this episode, putting aside the fact that Dr. Manhattan died. But one person dying versus 3 million, it's kind of a better deal. But when Lady Trieu opens the container, there is not a second Dr. Manhattan, but instead there is basically goo, where Senator Keene has been turned into goo. Then Lady Trieu gives her own speech, where she's basically holding the 7th Cavalry accountable for all of their crimes. It was pretty satisfying to see her reading out all of the wrongdoings that they've been up to and basically giving them a death sentence. It reminded me very much of Inglourious Bastards, when Shoshana's face appears in the theater and gives everyone the speech. This is the face of the Jew who killed you. This felt very much like that, and it was pretty satisfying to see Lady Trieu wipe them all out so easily and so violently with lasers. Dr. Manhattan teleports everybody, all the important people anyway, back to Antarctica, or all the people necessary to not save Dr. Manhattan, but stop Lady Trieu. And at Veight's base of operations, I thought it was pretty clever, using the frozen squid as basically a Gatling gun from space, as he described it, to kill Lady Trieu and save the day. But I will say, so like I said a minute ago, Watchmen doesn't feel like the kind of show where you get a clean ending. And we got a surprisingly clean ending here. And I will say it felt somewhat convenient that the raining frozen squid seemed like it killed almost no one. Maybe there were a couple of cops that got hit, but really just killed Lady Trieu. It was pretty awesome when she notices a hole in her hand. But yeah, kind of, like I said, just convenient that she was really the only casualty of it, especially since in the previous scene they say everything within 5 city blocks will be obliterated. Hope no one you care about is down there. Also, if you read the original graphic novel, I think there were many ways that this episode paralleled the final issue of the graphic novel. Just a couple off the top of my head. Number 1, you have the key characters all convening together after being separate for much of the run of the comics. You have the characters coming together at basically ground zero where the master plan is about to be enacted. So in this case, you have Looking Glass, you have Lori, you have Angela, you have Adrian Veidt, you've got everybody all together. Stanley McNatt in the chat, weird, she really showed no pain with the hole in her hand. Very odd. Yes, agreed. I think they were really trying to play up the whole Lady Trieu is so smart, so in control, that she very rarely lets her emotions get the better of her. And, or I think it was a mix of that and a mix of it happened so suddenly, it's almost like she didn't have a chance to react. I've read stories about people who get shot and it takes them a little bit to even realize they've been shot. But I think that's usually in moments of adrenaline, when things are crazy. And I can't necessarily say Lady Trieu was in one of those moments. But anyway, Adam, my younger brother in the chat, I'm not sure if you're still there and still listening, but if you want to chime in with your medical background, is it realistic for somebody to have a hole blown into their hand and for it not to really bother them a whole lot? We'll see if he chimes in. Or any other doctors in the chat. It's like when you're on an airplane and there's an emergency. Are there any doctors aboard? So any doctors, feel free to chime in. Now let's talk about Adrian Veidt a little bit. So in an unusual turn, most episodes we get Adrian Veidt at the end of the episode or somewhere in the middle of it. Here, we get Adrian Veidt in the opening. And as always, I love the Adrian Veidt scenes, and I thought this one was particularly great. When Ozymandias and the Game Master finally have their showdown, and for a moment, when Adrian Veidt got shot, it took me about a split second where I thought, wow, are they really going to get us to the point where Adrian's about to finally connect with the rest of their plot? Are they really just going to kill him right now? And thank God, just like in Back to the Future 3, I believe, he was wearing bulletproof armor, and he was fine-ish. Then he stabs the Game Master with his sharpened horseshoe, and he watches the Game Master die, who we see is just another Mr. Phillips clone. Ozymandias says to him, "It's almost over." Game Master says, "Master, may I ask you something?" Veidt says, "Of course." The Game Master asks, "Mask? Why did you make me wear a mask?" "Because masks make men cruel." "That's what you wanted? For me to be cruel?" "I had 8 years to kill. Having a worthy advisory helped keep me sane." "Was I, Master? Was I a worthy adversary?" Veidt says, "No, but you put on a hell of a show." And then the Game Master dies. And I have to say that I've never felt that bad for the Mr. Phillips or Crookshanks clones, just because they've been so devoid of personality. And these scenes always felt so strange and bizarre that I never really connected with them as human beings. But in this moment, I felt bad for the Game Master. And I'm not ashamed to say that it might have gotten a little bit misty in here when the Game Master finally died. Stanley in the chat says Game Master did serve his purpose. And I agree, he did. Adrian Veidt managed to survive 8 years, or I think 7 years, without going crazy. And he couldn't have done it without the Game Master. So if you think back to a scene, I think in episode 3 or 4, when Adrian Veidt is writing his letter to the Game Master, as he's writing that letter, as he's having Crookshanks write the letter for him, you can hear in his voice he's having a good time. He's excited to jab back at his rival, and you could see that that is something which kept him going, that joy of an adversary. And that might be one of my favorite twists of the show. That explanation makes sense and is totally satisfying, and it says something about the Adrian Veidt character. And was emotionally, like I said, surprisingly emotionally powerful. But it also made me, the Game Warden, that's right, Richard in the chat corrected me. It was the Game Warden, not the Game Master. So thank you for that. So Adrian Veidt, one of the things that I've been struggling with on this show is that I know intellectually that Adrian Veidt killed 3 million people. But it's kind of like that saying where the death of a million is a statistic, the death of one is a tragedy. Whenever I saw Adrian Veidt on this show, I couldn't bring myself to hate him as a villain. I, at times, felt bad for him, especially since this show feels so removed from the graphic novel. I mean, it's been so long since I read it, I was taking the show on its own terms. And I connected with the Adrian Veidt character. I wanted him to be successful and escape. But this scene, the death of one is a tragedy, the Game Warden, this person who's been programmed to be altruistic, who feels abandoned by his god, to watch him die and be killed by a horseshoe was pretty sad, and finally, successfully, made me kind of hate Adrian Veidt. Oh, I'll also say I loved that we see Adrian Veidt find out, we see how Adrian Veidt knew the satellite would be up there watching Europa. And it makes, because we see Lady Trieu tell him something like in exactly 5 years and change, there will be a satellite checking Europa to prove that Dr. Manhattan is there. So this whole time, Adrian Veidt knew the satellite was going to be there, and he was spelling out a message for the satellite. And like many people theorized, we saw "Save Me D," the rest of it was cut off, and it said "daughter." And not only did it say "daughter," but it makes so much sense that he would go out of his way. He could have just said "Save Me," knowing full well the satellite would see it. He went out of his way to spell "daughter," because he never said daughter aloud. He told her he would never call her daughter, so he knew if he took months to spell it out fully, it would be a gesture that would increase the odds that she would go out of his way. She would go out of her way to actually go and save him. And also an interesting point about Lady Trieu being Adrian Veidt's daughter is that it makes an interesting implication that genius is hereditary, because it's hard to argue with the fact that Lady Trieu is as smart and as talented as Adrian Veidt, considering she was able to start with essentially nothing and work her way up to at least $42 billion and got close to becoming a god. So this show has a few times toyed with the idea of consciousness, what makes you you. If Dr. Manhattan forgets who he is, does that change who he is? So the show pays a little bit more lip service to that theme again by positing that genius may be hereditary. Master Search in the chat. I wound up watching it late because I was watching WWE, tables, ladders, and chairs. LOL. I'm not the one to say, man, that ending sucked, and I won't hear. But it was rather disappointing. Master Search, if you, after the stream is over, go back and watch the beginning of it, you'll see that in some ways I agree with you. There's a lot I loved in this finale, and I would just say that, and I definitely didn't hate it. I wouldn't even say I disliked it, but I didn't walk away saying that was fully incredibly satisfying. Joshua in the chat, Adrian would never stop rationalizing murder. Very true. Up until the last second, he would never stop rationalizing murder. It's one of the themes of this show is that people think they know what's right. There's hubris behind that. They don't care about the collateral damage. They've done the math, and when they think they know what's right, they're just going to go and do it, and they're going to rationalize it, just like Adrian Veidt. Master Search in the chat. All that buildup, all these weeks just for some simple power-stealing plot, no hidden surprises. Wasn't a fan, wasn't awful, just didn't like it. I partially agree with that. Because, like I said at the start of this chat, I think this would have felt more satisfying if they put less emphasis on the mystery. The only reason some of us are feeling disappointed is because the show had that mystery box feel. It was constantly asking questions. A great finale doesn't need a big twist, but they kind of set us up to want one and expect one. And ultimately, it felt like there were a lot of pieces that we kind of knew how they were going to fall. In this episode, they fell exactly where we sort of expected them to. Poor Guy Fridge 29. Is Angela Abar the next Superman? I am going to say yes. I'm going to say definitely she is the next Superman. And we'll talk about a potential season 2, but I could easily see a season 2 at least partially focusing on how Angela Abar handles these powers. Because Dr. Manhattan had to deal with being a god. And there's no rule book for that. But this is an example where there is a little bit of a rule book. Angela Abar may get the powers of a god, and she has the benefit of having seen what went wrong previously. So what happens in the second go-around? Maybe we'll find out in a season 2. And by the way, for those of you that are watching this live right now, if you're not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you watch this video and you watch this channel, do you know what that means? It means you're awesome. If you subscribe, you are ever so slightly, just a little bit more awesome. And also make sure to subscribe to the OneTake podcast. Tomorrow I'll be sitting down with my friend and we'll be doing a complete recap and deep dive into tonight's episode. Anyway, more from the chat. Stanley McNatt, did you catch the contents on the bottle she squirted? In the tube of sperm, it looked like lotion, I guess for easy administration. Yeah, I don't think I need to add any more to that. I think we all saw what we saw there. Speaking of which, by the way, no appearance of Lube Man this episode. So if you remember a few episodes back when Angela was walking around, we see a tall, lanky, silver-suited man who runs, pours a bunch of, I believe, sunscreen onto himself so he can jump and slide into the sewers. Crazy scene, and he never showed up again. But for those of you who weren't following Peteypedia, the supplementary material of the show, it was all but confirmed that it was Petey in that suit. Kind of bizarre that they introduced that thread and never really had it come back. Dr. Manhattan's death. Let's talk about that. So, not exactly shocking because they told us over and over that it was coming. We knew it was coming. I'm curious, for those of you in the chat, when Dr. Manhattan was killed, they tried to make that a very emotional moment, right? He looks up at Angela and says, I'm experiencing every moment we had together, all at once. And I just have to say, I didn't really feel a whole lot in that scene. And I got to rewatch the episode without the distraction of wondering what's going to happen next. But I think this was just another case of so much was going on. I was just waiting to see how the episode was going to conclude. What's the big twist going to be? Is there going to be a twist? That I just didn't really feel very present in that moment for Dr. Manhattan's death, which is kind of a bummer because Dr. Manhattan's such a major character, and I would have hoped that it would have hit harder. But let me know in the chat if you disagree with me on that. Let's see. Crystal Love. Yes, she is, and I don't like that they could have made that scene a little longer. Crystal, I believe you're talking about the final scene where Angela is about to step on the water, and it cuts right before she does. I agree. I don't know why they kept that ambiguous. To me, it was so clear that she inherited his powers. I mean, they foreshadowed that so much that it would make absolutely no sense if she didn't inherit his powers. So I'm not sure what they're trying to say by making that ending more ambiguous. Joshua in the chat, the show uses the superhero as a backdrop for exploring power dynamics between whites, blacks, and Asians. That opening insemination scene, Dr. Manhattan's capture, etc. Yes, 100% agree. And actually, when the season started, I was anticipating that they would use the mask theme to tie into that because you can't tell who's behind the mask, right? A theme that was very present in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. They always said anybody could be behind the mask. That movie made it true. And then in this show, they hit on that especially hard with Hooded Justice, where we find out that it's Will Reeves under there and he had to hide his race. So one of the worries I had going into this season is they're taking a pre-existing universe and applying it to a theme that it wasn't originally intended for, this theme of race. And I was a little worried about it, but I have to say that in that regard, the show knocked it out of the park. It didn't occur to me how well those two worlds would mesh, how well Watchmen could be used to explore that idea, and I thought it worked incredibly well. And if there is a season 2, Damon Lindelof has talked about this. Anytime he's asked about a season 2, he gives a very long non-answer. His most recent answer, he compared it to Fargo, where each season is an anthology, unrelated to the previous season. He talked about True Detective. So if we get a season 2, I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be unrelated to this first season. There might be some crossover with pre-existing characters, but it's in general going to be a self-contained new story. And I would love to see them use it to once again explore other themes, other issues that we are or have faced in the past. Stanley McNatt in the chat, I think Petey is Lube Man. I agree, and I think it's all but confirmed that that's the case. Joshua in the chat, the swell of music in the moment when Dr. Manhattan was killed, the swell of music tried too hard to make that moment more emotional and impactful. I think I agree with you there. It kind of just felt like this big climax. Everything on screen was going nuts. The music was going nuts. And it kind of just washed over me, which is ironic because otherwise in this episode, I thought the score was great. Like I said earlier, when Lady Trieu activates the Millennium Clock, the score worked so well to ratchet up the tension and make you feel like Doomsday was truly upon us. Maybe I was just burnt out after so much of that. By the time we got to Dr. Manhattan's death, I was kind of just drained, and the score was no longer going to be as effective on me. Mike in the chat, confused about where he turns into Cal for a little bit. Was not sure if it was just to connect with the audience. He still had abilities inside the cage. I guess he chose not to be a god anymore. Mike, I think you are 80% right. I think he chose to look like Cal again, not for us. I think he did it for Angela. He knew he was about to die, and for a moment, he wanted to, as much as possible, connect with Angela, and he wanted the last face she sees to be the one he wore when they were in love for 10 years. I believe that's why he changed back. Rage Not, good to see you again. One of our most loyal listeners on this channel. One of those awesome people I told you about earlier. Rage Not says, enjoying the show very much. Can't wait to see what you review next. Speaking of which, anybody in the chat, if you know what I should review next, please tell me, because we're currently talking about The Mandalorian. That ends in a couple of weeks. I will definitely be talking about Westworld. I'll be talking about Better Call Saul, but there's going to be a 2 or 3 month gap there. I'll talk about movies and stuff, but if there's any shows I should be watching, tell me in the chat or leave it in the comments after this video. Stanley McNatt in the chat, they mentioned making the cage out of those watch batteries. It's part of a watch battery content and inhibitor to Manhattan's powers. Is that something they mentioned? I recall in this episode where they talked about those batteries. Is that something they established earlier in the season? That's not something I remember. Joshua in the chat, favorite part of the finale was probably the lead up to Dr. Manhattan's death. Once he died, it pretty much became standard fare. The theater conversation between Angela and her grandfather was touching, though. I agree with all of that. The lead up was great. So much tension. I love the score there. This is one of those shows where I'm going to download the score on Spotify, and it's going to be something I listen to over and over. Alexandra, The Expanse, a recommendation for me to watch and review on this channel. That's one I've thought about. I watched a few episodes of that back in season 1. I actually quite liked it, but just somehow fell off the wagon. But it's been recommended to me a few times since then, so I'm going to put it back on the list. Maybe I'll try and catch up, and we'll cover that on this channel. Speaking of which, I said it a couple times, but if you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe. Later this week, we'll be talking about Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker. Going to do a big watch party event. I'll be live streaming before I see it. I'll be live streaming after I see it, which will be about 2 or 3 in the morning, Thursday night / Friday morning. So make sure to subscribe, and make sure to subscribe to the OneTake podcast for a deeper dive on this episode when I sit down with my friend Jeremy to break it all down for you. Stanley McNatt in the chat, the masked guys were saving up a pile of the batteries during the raid at the farm. That is right. It's right. Earlier in the season, we saw them collecting all those batteries, didn't quite know what it was for, and in this episode, confirmed they melted down the batteries. They used those to build Dr. Manhattan's cage. Joshua in the chat, it would have been nice to understand Dr. Manhattan's debatable death wish. For someone so powerful, there is a surprising lack of will to survive. Hooded Justice even said he could have done more. So they have somewhat addressed that in the comic and in the show. Dr. Manhattan's kind of an enigma. So he's said a few times that we're all puppets on a string. He's a very deterministic person. He doesn't believe he can change the future. He says the only difference between us and him is that he's also a puppet. The difference is he can see the strings. And in the, I believe last episode, Dr. Manhattan admits that he regrets interfering in the Vietnam War and essentially turning it into a slaughter. He knows the future. He knew he was going to regret it. So why didn't he stop himself? It seems like maybe he couldn't stop himself. Similarly, in the graphic novel, the comedian, in a pretty devastating scene in the graphic novel, the comedian was in the Vietnam War. He impregnated a woman there, and she basically confronts him. She's pregnant, and she doesn't want him to just leave without acknowledging her or helping her in any way. He takes out a gun in front of Dr. Manhattan and kills that innocent woman and presumably her child. Dr. Manhattan essentially chides him, and the comedian says to Dr. Manhattan, "You could have stopped me, but you chose not to. You're really losing your touch." And that was back in the 70s. So you've got to imagine that now his moral compass has got to be all messed up. But that is something I would love to understand more. I mean, Dr. Manhattan was somebody I was so excited to see on this show, which is why last episode was one of my favorites. But yes, Hooded Justice Will Reeves, in one of the last scenes of the show, says, in reference to Dr. Manhattan, he was a good man, but considering what he could do, he could have done more. And I don't think we'll ever get a fully satisfying answer to why he didn't do more. Unless the only way we may get a better answer to that is if there is a season 2, Angela manifests her powers, essentially becomes Dr. Manhattan 2.0, and she does attempt to do all those things that Dr. Manhattan chose not to, and maybe we'll see what happens, what goes wrong when you try to play God. Mike in the chat, his weakness was love, though, right? He seemed to lack the will to stick around. Where Angela fought for John, where he fell in love with her, seemed like he had a true ride or die. Yeah, it's, like I said, he's an enigma. I was surprised that they used love to bring him back into the fold, because it seemed like by the end of the graphic novel, he'd so lost touch with humanity. But then again, right at the end there, back in the original graphic novel, he did sort of rediscover the miracle of humanity. And I guess I could follow that thread to him once again falling in love with someone. But you would think if he's capable of loving an individual, he would also have compassion for humankind and would want to do more to help them. But yeah, I mean, like he keeps saying, it's the whole determinism thing. If we asked Dr. Manhattan these questions, he would say, I can't stop myself from dying. I'm already dying. I'm experiencing that death in your future right now. But of course, to our minds, that just doesn't make sense, because it would appear that we've seen him change the past, right? When he is simultaneously talking to Will Reeves 10 years ago and talking to Angela today, Angela asked Dr. Manhattan to ask the past version of Will Reeves how he knew about Judd. And Dr. Manhattan asking that question is how Will Reeves knew about Judd in the first place. So we're asking questions about someone who's not human, about someone who experiences the world and time in a totally different way. So there's no way I think that we can get a truly satisfying answer to it. But it's an interesting question to wonder about. Stanley in the chat, he left Earth once before. He was ready to leave again. But I guess, Stanley, you're saying he was ready to leave permanently. Josh in the chat, I'm generally not a fan of exposition. Senator's speech, but the reveal was fun. I know Lady Trieu is the stealth villain, but it was fun to see her work. Yeah, I'll say I thought this show for the first few episodes did an incredible job with exposition. It doled it out very organically. I think it started to lose it a little bit as the season went on. Some of the exposition became a little bit clunkier, where we got more speeches like Senator Keene's. But even Senator Keene's speech in this episode, they did a good job of, I think they did as good a job as possible when you're having a villain do the trope of giving their master plan, laying it all out before enacting it. And then Josh asks, how would you rate the season? I have to give it some more thought, because, like I said, I left the finale not quite fully satisfied, but I would say at a minimum it would get something like an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10. I can't really see that score going down upon giving it more thought, but if I think about it more, I could see that score maybe ticking up slightly, because the show did, I mean, like I've said a few times, the show was way better than it had any right to be. You're taking sacred material. You are knowingly creating a sequel to something where the original creator doesn't want you to do it. You are... Anyway, so Damon Lindelof, I think, for the most part, knocked it out of the park. My one big complaint that knocks points off the season is the fact that he applied the mystery box approach to the show. I found it distracting just about every episode, with a couple of exceptions. But I found myself watching each episode to get to the next little bit of exposition. What's going on with Adrian Veidt? What is the Millennium Clock? Where is Dr. Manhattan? And if I'm watching an episode about Looking Glass, where I'm seeing his struggles with anxiety, where I'm watching Lori and seeing how broken she is because she was left by the man she fell in love with. I should be able to watch those and be present for those moments, feel connected to those characters, and I did in bits and pieces, but then I would get distracted by, okay, but this is great and all, what's going on with Adrian Veidt? What is the master plan? What is the big plot we haven't seen yet? So that's what stops this show from being a 9 or higher for me. It gets knocked down a little bit because Damon Lindelof loves the mystery box approach, but I don't think it's the right fit for every series. And this is a case where I don't necessarily think it was the right fit. I don't know why we needed that mystery to explore these themes. So don't totally hate the mystery approach, but I do think they should have toned it down a little bit. Stanley in the chat, speaking of future streaming, and while I read the rest of your question there, let me take a sip of water. Speaking of future streaming, I will definitely need help understanding Westworld. Look forward to hearing your interpretation of that show. Stanley, thank you so much for saying so. It's comments like that that keep me wanting to do this and making this process just super enjoyable. And we'll talk about Westworld on this channel, and I'll also get my friend Jeremy, who I'm going to talk to tomorrow about Westworld, on the podcast to help me break it down, help me see what I was missing. In fact, one little kernel of truth he gave me tonight, he texted me after the episode aired, and if you go back and watch the episode, you'll see that when Angela walks out of the theater with Will and a few in her children, you'll see that the only letters remaining on the marquee are DRM, Dr. M for Dr. Manhattan. Those are the sorts of Easter eggs that my friend Jeremy will spot and point out, which you won't get on this channel unless you listen to the podcast. Anyway, enough about that. Joshua in the chat gives the season an 8.7 out of 10. Some exposition, Veidt as comic relief, thin motivation, some dropped threads, better tension, and world building than resolution. Josh, I think I agree with all of that, and my score is probably very close to the one you gave it. But I'm hopeful. I mean, so one question for all of you in the chat. Are you expecting a season 2? Do you want a season 2? And if we get a season 2, are there particular threads from this season that you'd want to see them pick back up? Like I said earlier in the stream, if we do get a season 2, my feeling based off of everything Damon Lindelof has said about it is that they're going to treat this as essentially an anthology show. Season 2 will likely focus on a new cast of characters, maybe bringing a handful of them back from Season 1, but it's going to be a new story, unconnected to this one. Crystal in the chat says, yes, with 3 exclamation points. So Crystal wants a Season 2. I think we're going to get one, but I do think they'll probably take 2 or 3 years before it's on the air. It really sounds like the way Damon Lindelof describes it is they constructed this season, they put everything they had into it. They weren't thinking about anything beyond this one season, which I do think is an admirable approach to creating a TV series, because many other shows like Damon Lindelof's past series Lost kind of stretch on and on without a satisfying resolution. And in this season, even though I wouldn't say it was 100% satisfying, it was pretty close. Josh says, 9 out of 10 for analysis. So much to unpack regarding cultural conversation around history, society. I don't know if they need a season 2. Anthology might work. I agree. They don't need a season 2, but then again, they didn't need a season 1, right? There was something... If you listen to the interviews with Damon Lindelof, he turned down creating Watchmen, the TV series, over and over. They were offering this to him years ago, and he didn't want to do it. The way he ended up doing it is he learned about the Tulsa Massacre, and he wanted to tell people about it. But because the Tulsa Massacre is really interesting. When the first episode of the season aired, people thought it was a fictional event that was created for this show. But it was a real thing that happened, and one of the things that shockingly was buried in history. It's not something many of us learned about in school. So Damon Lindelof found out about it, was embarrassed and shocked that he didn't know about it already, wanted to tell people. But when he sat down and talked to people about it, their eyes basically glaze over. They don't want to talk about it. So he finally realized, hey, I can use Watchmen as essentially a Trojan horse to tell people not just about the Tulsa Massacre, but everything else he learned, where that was kind of the seed, where he then learned more about this struggle that isn't talked about as much as we would like it to be, or at least Damon Lindelof would like it to be. So he used this show as a Trojan horse for that idea, and that was kind of the trigger. So it wasn't that Watchmen needed a continuation, but he found something where Watchmen was an appropriate vehicle to use to talk about. So I think in the next 2 or 3 years, if Damon Lindelof or somebody else has inspiration and they see a way that this show can be used to explore a new theme, I think that's what would give us a season 2. Josh, LOL, I learned about the massacre 3 times in school, high school, and twice in college. Yeah, you may have gone to some better schools than I did, because I'm pretty certain I didn't learn about them. Unless you're younger than me, and maybe schools have improved in that regard. Josh asks, do you think the Confederate stuff was a backdoor test for Watchmen? You have to elaborate on that. Are you talking about the show that was canceled, where David Benioff and what's the other guy's name? D&D from Game of Thrones, where they were going to create that show, The Confederate, and it got canceled? Is that what you're referring to there? Because if that was the case, I would think, if anything, that may have made HBO a little bit more scared to approach Watchmen, because that show was met, when they even talked about producing it, was met with a pretty big backlash. I would have thought that might have scared HBO off. So I'm not sure. The two might have been... I mean, I think there's no way that those two shows were in development, the Confederate and Watchmen. No way both of those shows were in development, and nobody had a conversation about, hey, we've got a couple of shows that are exploring similar themes, and if the Confederate did eventually materialize, I'm sure they would have taken notes from it to say, how do we approach Watchmen, or do we need to approach it differently? But whether one directly affected the other, I doubt we'll ever know the answer to that. Maybe Damon Lindelof, he does seem to be pretty open in his interviews, so maybe we will learn a little bit more about the behind-the-scenes stuff as he talks more about this show. Anyway, I think that's most of what I wanted to say about this episode and this season as a whole. I will say again, if you're not subscribed, make sure to hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell icon to make sure you get notified the next time we go live, which will likely be, like I said, Thursday night for the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker watch party. And also make sure to subscribe to the OneTake podcast. There's a link in the show notes. I'll be talking to my friend Jeremy tomorrow, where we will talk about this episode in more detail. We'll talk about the season as a whole. He's also a huge Star Wars fan, so I'll have him on again later in the week to talk about Rise of Skywalker. I'll just look at the last few things you're saying here in the chat. Joshua says HBO seeing how best to tackle those themes. Watchmen handled it better. I think without having actually seen the Confederate, but what little we know about it, I think we can all confidently say Watchmen definitely handled those themes better. Rage Not, as always, says, smash that like button. Couldn't agree more. You're all awesome. Everybody that's here right now is an amazing person. But if you hit that subscribe button, it's kind of like Angela eating that egg. Just makes you ever so slightly more awesome. Josh says, thanks for doing another stream. Stanley says, thanks again. All of you are very welcome. And I just want to say, to close this out, thanks to all of you for joining these live streams the last few weeks. You can see by the number of subscribers I have, this is a fairly new YouTube channel, and doing these Watchmen live streams has been a great way for me to be able to do a live stream and not do it into an abyss. There are people here to interact with, and I love watching movies. I love watching TV. I love talking about them, and you don't always get an opportunity to do that in real life. So this is my forum to do that. You've all given me that forum. You've all made this a blast. And I can't wait to do more live streams. So like I said, please subscribe. And I look forward to talking to all of you again in the future. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.